After investigating other insect-borne diseases, the U.S. Army Medical Command concluded that yellow fever was the best pathogen to use against and the most likely agent to be used by the communists. Military analysts had coldly calculated that virus-infected mosquitoes were more cost-effective than germ-laden aerosols if the goal was to attack and maximize mortality. The southern states were viewed as a prime target, the backwater of the nation, with poor medical services and crude pest management practices. DDT was the viable defense, but only if an afflicted region had the modern equipment to spray the insecticide. Nor were these analyses merely mental exercises. The seriousness with which the U.S. military took the Soviet threat was exemplified in the elevated status granted to Camp Detrick, which became Fort Detrick in February 1956. Along with this came a new round of secret studies on mosquitoes, and the human test subjects were no longer volunteers. From April to November 1956, within residential areas of Savannah, Georgia, the U.S. military conducted simulated attacks using uninfected mosquitoes. Although many of the details are lacking, the first experiment, codenamed Operation Mayday, was intended to determine whether mosquitoes released as if they'd been dispersed from bombs and warheads would find and bite people. The insects reliably fed on the unsuspecting public, and these encouraging results provided the foundation for the next study. Well, what follows in the rest of this chapter is a description of a series of tests called the bellwether tests, in which we conduct increasingly refined studies, including a study of a strain of mosquitoes developed at Fort Detrick for a high propensity for attacking and biting humans. By 1960, the entomologists at Fort Detrick had drawn up plans for a facility at Pine Bluff, Arkansas that would have been capable of producing 100 million infected mosquitoes a month. And the U.S. Army Chemical Corps drafted, and I have a copy of parts of this, what was called an entomological warfare target analysis that identified Moscow, Stalingrad, Vladivostok, Canton, Shanghai, and Cairo specifically as cities where a yellow fever attack would take hold. So what I want to do now is leap from these frigid days of the Cold War and jump ahead to today. Is entomological warfare, and in particular in today's world, entomological terrorism, something that we should be concerned with? Well, let me tell you about an event that unfolded in recent years. And so we're going to shift now to this notion of terrorism. Because I think it's true that in the modern world, asymmetrical conflicts are going to increasingly define world threats. So let's consider a case study in which insects were used in the third form in which they've been used historically, and that is to inflict economic damage, in this case via agriculture. So now we're going to turn to entomological terrorism in an effort to destroy agriculture. The Mediterranean fruit fly is the world's most destructive pest of fruits, capable of causing staggering agricultural losses and triggering massive control programs. It's also one of the prettiest pests, that's kind of an entomologist thing, with the housefly-sized adults sporting wings that look like stained glass and earth tones. The larvae, on the other hand, are voracious little maggots that gorge themselves on everything from avocados, coffee, olives, and tomatoes to bananas, citrus, mangoes, and peaches. Although the species is found in Hawaii, it has not become established on the mainland, and the agricultural industry desperately wants to keep it that way. I'll talk a little bit here about the bionomics of this pest. Agricultural economists have estimated that an establishment of the Mediterranean fruit fly in California, which would trigger a quarantine of Californian fruits and vegetables nationally as well as internationally, would cost 132,000 jobs and $13.5 billion. Okay, so that's what's at stake with this single pest if it were to become established in California. So it's no wonder that when localized medfly infestations are detected, colossal eradication programs ensue. In 1980 to 82, an incipient infestation in the San Francisco Bay Area triggered the aerial application of malathion-laced bait over an area of 1,400 square miles at a cost of $100 million. As a nerve poison, malathion is toxic to a broad spectrum of insects and invertebrates, including people. Although it is one of the safer organophosphate insecticides, malathion had more than sufficient hazards to raise the ire of environmental activists. So when pockets of medflies were found again in 1988, radical environmentalists were primed to sabotage the insecticide program. By 1989, the state's aerial campaign against the medfly was in full swing. The entomologists were armed with tons of chemical weapons, and the eco-terrorists were armed with biological weapons. In early December, the environmentalists' bizarre counteroffensive was announced to the public. Headline in the LA Times announced, "Mystery letter puts a strange twist on latest medfly crisis." The upshot of the story was captured in the first few lines. The Mediterranean fruit fly crisis has taken an odd turn, with law enforcement officials tentatively investigating a mysterious letter from a group that claims to be breeding and spreading the pest throughout Southern California. The group, calling itself the Breeders, said in an unsigned letter to Mayor Tom Bradley, agricultural officials, and media that it was angered by repeated aerial spraying of pesticide to eradicate the fly and decided to make the medfly problem unmanageable and aerial spraying politically and financially intolerable. The two-page letter opened with a diatribe concerning aerial spraying of carcinogenic pesticides over populated urban areas, and then asserted that the biosphere of the planet is on the verge of collapse. Pesticides are in the food, the water, the soil, and the air, all this because some of us suffer rapacious and narrow-minded greed. According to the letter, the breeders have been clandestinely producing medflies and releasing them to continuously expand the spray areas in LA and Orange counties. Having already forced the treatment program to encompass 232 square miles, the breeders were prepared to up the ante. If the spray program was not terminated, they threatened to spread the infestation into the enormously valuable and productive San Joaquin Valley. As evidence of their handiwork, the breeders pointed out state officials have probably noticed an increase as well as the unusual distribution of medfly infestations in Los Angeles County since March of 1989. The allusion to an unusual distribution of medflies actually described the patterns that were being seen by field workers. Rex McGee, Associate Director of the California Department of Food and Agriculture, noted that this particular infestation has some characteristics we have not seen in the past. Although officials couldn't be certain that eco-terrorists were to blame, there was no doubt that someone was desperate enough to stop the spray program, and ordinary Californians were being drawn into the fray. Well, let me skip ahead a bit to get toward the end of the story here. In a February story in the Los Angeles Times reported that county fly trappers have found far fewer larvae than expected in an infestation this large, and the discovery of new adult flies often has occurred just outside the infestation boundaries, forcing a steady expansion of the spraying zone. Again, the evidence strongly supporting that something unnatural was at work. Many found the breeders' plot just too convoluted to believe, but a state official noted, in one of my favorite quotes in the whole book, "You've got 8.5 million people out there. You never know. There's always a chance that someone out there has a loose screw." The most reasonable tactic may not occur to the terrorist who is motivated by passion. And the breeder's tactic, whether rational or insane, seemed to be working. Not only was the public increasingly angered with the health, environmental, and economic costs of the program, but pest managers were starting to second-guess the entire operation. The Los Angeles Times article noted that the mere possibility of reared and released insects has forced officials to become a bit more cautious in their campaign against the medfly. The California Department of Food and Agriculture announced a 2-week delay after finding new flies in their traps on the Cal Poly Pomona campus, saying, "We're always cognizant of the breeders thing. We wanted to make sure that these were really wild flies. We can't afford to start a new treatment area until we know what we've got."